Hello and welcome to this video on the weird reality that could be The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. While the original book by Baum is a much better source, the movies are a more impactful way of showing you what's happening. Based on what we see in the original movie, there are a lot of lessons that can be taken away. The basic premise of The Wizard of Oz is well known, and often satirized, but let's go with a quick summary. A young Midwestern girl has a horrible encounter with a Karen. Then she's subject to a tornado. After this, she wakes up, having killed someone with a house, steals their shoes, and goes on a fanciful journey to get back home. Along the way, she finds 3 compatriots, 3 symbolic items, and keeps on as a murder hobo by killing yet another person who she claims is a witch in charge of flying monkeys, monster trees, and bizarre skinned men. Eventually she finds her way to a mysterious guru who can tell her how to get home, but not in reality. While yes, you could say The Wizard of Oz is an allegorical passage through development of one sort or another, just like Alice in Wonderland, why take it seriously and stop having some fun? To start with, the chances of all this being a fever dream of some sort are very high. Head injuries, disease, vitamin deficiencies, and more were all common in that area. Each of these is a good explanation for what we see. Given we start the movie with a tornado, the probability of Dorothy having experienced trauma in the form of something solid hitting her head is not small. This could immediately lead to the events we see in The Wizard of Oz, as it's all simply a dream driven by damage to her head. Whether that's an issue to do with brain damage, buildup of blood, delirium, nausea, and so on, or something more, it's hard to say. There is also a distinct possibility that, if not because of those injuries but something else, Dorothy was drugged. This could explain both her weird psychedelic dream, but also her later actions. Some drugs are better known for influencing the psychological state of someone than others. LSD is a good example. There are also frog secretions, plant extracts, and more. Each of these influences how reality is perceived and how the senses are processed by both the cognitive mind and the relevant parts of the brain for those senses. A more common example for the modern world are anticholinergic drugs. These can and often do cause confusion and delirium, especially in the elderly. Think of what a bad trip would be like and then some. We have previously described in more detail how methamphetamine could do and does do something in a similar vein. This could very well apply to Dorothy. Fever can also cause delirium. Delirium is a state of mental disorder and cognitive malfunction. Fever causes delirium in several ways. The first is simply that it changes blood pressure throughout the body. Vascular dilation and constriction. This influences oxygenation to start with, and if this is due to injury, she may not have good oxygenation to start with, leading to problems with the brain beginning to shut down, releasing chemicals, and thereby causing her to experience a state of euphoria or delusion. The second and possibly more poignant in this case is encephalopathy. That is swelling around the brain causing pressure to be applied. These circumstances can lead to hallucination and changed mental state. Considering what we see and the changes in Dorothy's behavior, it is entirely possible that she is suffering from some sort of encephalopathy. This causes not only a change in her mental state, but also a degree of change in her personality. As she goes throughout the movie, she does become rather more aggressive. Diseases and pathologies can cause similar effects. This occurs through poor, no, or wrong functioning of organs and systems. Diseases such as pneumonia and influenza can cause delirium and/or encephalopathy. Bacterial meningitis is better known today, and Neisseria meningitis can occur where air conditioning is not maintained. There are also situations in which organs can begin to malfunction or be dysfunctional. This then leads to cognitive problems. One of these is called hepatic encephalopathy. In short, issues with liver function lead to metabolites being produced that are not particularly conducive to health. And because of these metabolic abnormalities, you wind up with cognitive dysfunction. This can also lead to things like encephalopathy due to the problems it causes with the blood, particularly blood pressure. Where we're not just talking about things like encephalitis, there are many viruses, bacteria, and changes in bodily function that can cause changes in cognitive function. Beyond and above these, we need to look at things like vitamin deficiencies. Vitamin deficiencies can cause neurological issues. This is more than just a slight cognitive decline, but complete dysfunction. Wernicke encephalopathy is an example of this. It is caused by a thiamine deficiency. Thiamine, or thiamine, depending on how you choose to pronounce it, is one of the B group vitamins, and without enough of it, you often find that they begin developing neurological problems. Fortunately, it's also reversible by administration of these vitamins. There is a possibility that rather than being physiological, this whole situation could be a psychiatric disorder, a fantasy to cope with killing another human. Think Sucker Punch if you want an example that's more easily accessed. The psychological distress that can come from killing is not insignificant. This is best shown by World War I research into what was called shell shock. We now know it as PTSD. Officers in particular were better studied for the psychiatric impact of the death they dealt. They could exhibit any range of symptoms. These went from physical changes such as tics to mutism. In other cases, they could be more impacted and influencing their perception of reality. This is very similar to acute psychosis. This is further evidenced by her recidivism in killing yet more people, stealing things, and engaging in other antisocial behavior. While Dorothy is one thing, the world of Oz is another. We have walking lions, scarecrows, and tin men. There are flying monkeys, winkies, and munchkins. Each of these is not entirely impossible, but the collective events seem improbable. The walking, talking lion could be either a case of the wild boys of India or the werewolf syndrome. Going back as far as 1872 to some of the earliest documented examples, we have children being found in Uttar Pradesh in northern India. Hunters found a pack of wolves traveling through the forest, but they had with them a child who was behaving like a wolf and had largely been incorporated into them. Although not the only instance of this sort of event, this is the first and earliest documentation that we could find. It turns out that the child had effectively been abandoned and then raised by the wolves rather than eaten by them. They had adapted as best they could to the lifestyle of a wolf. In this case, what we might be seeing with the cowardly lion is instead a child somehow raised as a lion and then attempting to behave like one, but not succeeding for rather obvious reasons, given the differences between a person and lion. The alternative is hypertrichosis. This is an interesting disorder, although not necessarily one that's particularly adverse to life. It's largely symptomatic of an abnormally large or high amount of growth of hair all over the body. This then leads to someone appearing to be more animal-like than they would otherwise. This is often a congenital disorder, although it can be acquired later in life due to various environmental factors. And it is entirely possible that the cowardly lion is suffering from this condition and has therefore been socially ostracized. The Scarecrow and Tin Man are, well, frankly, we're going to go with the simple answer of they're either an animatronic or they're charlatans trying to con people out of their money. The Munchkins are where we start to diverge from the easily predicted and answered. The obvious solution we've come up with is that they could be a case of dwarfism, but dwarfism is generally somewhat adverse to life, if only because they can't reach things on the top shelf. In more practical terms, there's often a number of comorbidities closely associated with dwarfism. These tend to shorten their life significantly. The other issue here is that it has become so prevalent that it is the go-to phenotype in their population, not the abnormality as it would be in most others. There appear to be no non-pathological carriers of a gene that affects height in their entire population. There are a number of different mutations that could have occurred, and it is possible, although unlikely given how common the dwarfism is among the Munchkins, that any single mutation is not responsible for all of the cases. That's because you would often require 2 copies of the gene. When you have 1 copy only, you would no longer be a dwarf or a Munchkin. This leads to a simple conclusion that the entire population must carry 1, if not possibly more, genes that are responsible for dwarfism. The Winkies, or soldiers of the Wicked Witch, could also be in a similar situation, where, due to recessive genes and some degree of inbreeding, they could have developed into a less developed and advanced humanoid, similar to the difference between a Neanderthal and a Homo sapien. This means that they would both be more aggressive due to various hormones and similar pumping throughout their body, but they also wouldn't necessarily have the same intelligence. Reading through the backstory and lore for the Winkies, it would appear that they aren't a particularly aggressive species, but they are particularly sneaky. This means it's entirely possible that they could be a parallel species to humans, but going down a different branch. This is what we see with Neanderthalis and Homo sapien. They are 2 roughly parallel stages of human evolution. We can see 2 parallel species when we compare Neanderthals and sapien, but what if we look at something where the species is smaller? There is a well-known, if somewhat controversial, example of this with Homo floresiensis. These are sometimes also called the hobbits. They were a dwarfed species of Homo sapien in a manner of speaking, and it's thought that this may be due to the long-term isolation of the species on an island. Finally, we have the flying monkeys. While we should at some point make a full video on the sheer number and nature of the changes needed for this creature to be, for now let's look at the simplest of summaries. The bone structure is possibly able to be much finer and more delicate, similar to the way some dinosaur bones were much more finely made, similar to a modern bird bone. Then we need to allow for the fact that there needs to be a significant increase in muscle mass. The fact that they can also carry a whole person is likely to indicate that they have a not insignificant amount of strength. It is this in combination with the intelligence where they are able to follow instructions and execute things in an intelligent way that makes us wonder just how likely they are, especially if they're not an apex predator like humans would be. When we talk about the flying monkeys, it's worth remembering that the whole reason they came into play was that the Witch of the West sent them off to pick up Dorothy. Dorothy then dealt with the Wicked Witch by throwing a bucket of water on her and melting her. How then do you melt someone with just water? The answer is that they need to be very different at a physiological level than your average normal human. The alternative to this is that what Dorothy threw on the witch was not water. Let's assume Dorothy is not a sadistic serial killer for now, despite the evidence. It is possible that the witch had an interaction between water that passed through her skin and generated toxic materials. This led to or at least the development of, a very volatile and dangerous substance. Something similar, but not exactly the same, and certainly nowhere near as deadly, occurs in what is called aquagenic urticaria. It's a rare condition in which people are allergic to water. They will often develop hives and skin irritation. This can often be deadly in the form of an anaphylaxis. The alternative to this, if we take the witch's death as a pure allegorical tale, is that rather than dying in a way in which she melts, she goes into shock and dies from that due to the sudden blood loss from the anaphylaxis. Finally, there is the fallacy of a single, all-knowing, all-powerful figure to guide you. In fact, "don't look behind the curtain" has become something of a catchphrase. Critical thinking and self-direction was the only way Dorothy was going to get home. Then again, she only did so after a killing spree that she may not want to take herself home with. Considering this, a little bit of critical thinking at the very beginning might have saved Dorothy a very long and unpleasant story. Psychedelic dreams, flying monkeys, and witches seem to be the least of Dorothy's worries. As weird and wonderful as the land of Oz is, it is surprisingly possible on a case-by-case basis. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you might have below.